Clayton Archer's voice cracked through the Archer family parlor like a rifle shot, silencing every last one of them mid-sentence. "She is keeping this land," he said, "and I will not hear another word." His older brother Randall stood with his hat crushed in his fist, jaw tight, eyes burning with something that lived somewhere between fury and disbelief. Their mother, Margaret Archer, sat rigid in her velvet chair by the fire, hands folded in her lap as if the act of folding them kept the whole world from spinning apart. His younger sister Delia pressed herself against the doorframe, watching Clayton with wide, searching eyes. And his uncle Harold, who had ridden 2 days from Abilene just to be present for this particular argument, stood near the window with his thumbs hooked in his suspenders, his expression carved from stone. None of them spoke. None of them dared. Because Clayton Archer, who had spent 34 years being the quiet one, the reasonable one, the son who deferred and measured and kept the peace, that man was gone. The man standing in his place had a set to his jaw that none of them had seen before, a fire in his dark eyes that told every person in that room he had already made up his mind, and that making up his mind was not the beginning of a conversation. It was the end of one. "Clayton," his mother said softly, and that single word held 17 different warnings folded inside it. "I said what I said, Mother." His voice was low now, controlled, but it did not waver. "Emma Hart is keeping the Donahue land. It is hers by deed, by right, and by law, and if any man in this family tries to interfere with that," he let his gaze move slowly across the room, touching each of them in turn, "then that man will answer to me." The fire crackled. Wind pressed against the window glass, and somewhere in the long, heavy silence that followed, something between the Archer family and their youngest son shifted in a way that would never fully shift back. But none of them knew yet how it had come to this. None of them knew Emma Hart's name 3 months ago. None of them knew what Clayton had seen, what he had done, what he had felt in those weeks between the first spring thaw and this night. They did not know about the deed tucked inside a leather satchel, or the man who had tried to burn a barn with a woman still inside it, or the moment Clayton Archer had stood in a muddy field at dawn and understood, with the particular clarity that only comes from nearly losing something, exactly what he could not live without. To understand why Clayton Archer told his family that Emma Hart was keeping the land and he would not hear another word about it, you would have to go back to the beginning. You would have to go back to April. The spring of 1878 came late to Colton County, Kansas, the way it sometimes did grudgingly, with a last hard freeze that killed the early blossoms and left the ranchers calculating losses before May even arrived. The Archer spread sat on the eastern edge of the county, 3,000 acres of good grass and reliable water that Clayton's father had built from nothing after the war. When his father died of fever 2 winters back, the land passed equally to Randall and Clayton, with the understanding that Randall managed it and Clayton worked it, because that was the way it had always been between them. The Donahue property sat on the western border of the Archer land, separated by a shallow creek called Sutter's Run that dried to a trickle in August and flooded brown and furious in March. Patrick Donahue had ranched it for 12 years, never particularly successfully, but always stubbornly, with the particular determination of a man who had something to prove and had not finished proving it yet. He died in February, a horse accident, quick and senseless in the way those things always were, and left behind a wife he had sent for from Ohio 18 months ago, a woman named Emma Hart who had come west on faith and found herself, at 26 years old, alone on a struggling Kansas ranch with no family within 800 miles, a mortgage deed she barely understood, and a community that was already circling. Clayton heard about Patrick Donahue's death the way he heard most local news, at the feed store in the town of Colton, spoken in that low, careful tone men used when they were being respectful about a death, but were also already thinking about the land. He heard the name Emma Hart. He did not think much about it immediately. He had his own troubles that spring, His own accounts to balance and fences to mend and arguments with Randall about whether to bring in more cattle or consolidate what they had. It was Delia who changed things. His sister was 22, sharp-eyed and kind-hearted, and she had gone with the women of the Colton Methodist Church to bring food to Emma Hart in the days after Patrick's death. She came home with a look on her face that Clayton recognized. It was the look she got when something had made her indignant on someone else's behalf. "She is completely alone out there," Delia said at supper that evening, setting down her fork as if the weight of what she had to say required both hands free. "Patrick's brother showed up from St. Louis, been here 2 days, and he is already talking to Ben Hargrove at the bank about the property. And Emma just sits there. She does not even know what is happening right in front of her." Clayton looked up from his plate. "Patrick have debts?" "Some, but the land is hers by deed. Patrick put it in her name when they married, because he was trying to protect her in case something happened." Delia's voice had an edge to it. "And now his brother Cyrus wants to contest it. He is saying Emma has no means to run a ranch, so the deed is some kind of burden on her that the family ought to relieve her of. He has got a lawyer coming from Wichita." "That is between them," Randall said, reaching for the bread. "It should not be," Delia said quietly, looking at Clayton. He did not say anything that night, but he thought about it. The next morning, early, before the ranch hands were fully stirring, Clayton saddled his bay horse and rode west along Sutter's Run. It was not a considered decision, exactly. It was more the kind of thing a man does when something is nagging at the back of his mind, and the only remedy is movement. He told himself he was checking the fence line near the creek. That was not entirely a lie. He did check the fence line. He also kept riding until the Donahue property came into view. It was a modest spread, a farmhouse that needed paint, a barn that leaned slightly to the south, a chicken coop, a vegetable garden plot that had been dug and turned but not yet planted. The morning was cold and still smelled of frost. Smoke was coming from the farmhouse chimney. Clayton pulled his horse to a stop at the fence line and sat there, watching the smoke rise, wondering what exactly he intended to do now that he was here. The farmhouse door opened, and a woman walked out. She was carrying a bucket in each hand, walking toward the barn with the kind of purposeful stride that meant she had already been awake for hours and had a plan for each of them. She was not tall, but she moved like someone who was not accustomed to being stopped. Her hair was dark and pinned back practically. She was wearing a coat that was too large for her, almost certainly her late husband's. She did not look up until she was nearly at the barn door, and then she did, and she saw him sitting on his horse at her fence line, and she stopped. They looked at each other across maybe 40 feet of frost-stiff grass. "Can I help you?" she called. Her voice was clear and carried the faint cadence of someone from further east, Ohio or Pennsylvania, a voice that had not yet fully softened into the flat open vowels of the plains. "Clayton Archer," he said. "I have the neighboring spread to the east." A pause. "You have been checking your fence line for about 10 minutes, she said. "I saw you from the window." He felt heat move up the back of his neck. "I came to see if you needed anything." She tilted her head, studying him. He could see even from this distance that her eyes were taking him apart with the careful, unhurried efficiency of a woman who had learned not to trust a kind offer too quickly. "I am managing," she said. "I heard Patrick's brother is in town." Something shifted in her posture, not fear exactly, more like the particular stillness of a person who is very deliberately not showing what they feel. "He is," she said. "What of it?" "Nothing," Clayton said. "Only that if you find you need someone who knows the local land laws or the layout of the county, or just someone who can sit across a table from a lawyer without flinching, I would be willing to do that." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Why?" It was a good question, a direct question, the kind that deserved a direct answer rather than the comfortable deflection of saying something about being a good neighbor. "Because my sister said you were alone out here and that someone was trying to take advantage of that," he said, "and I do not like that." Emma Hart looked at him for another moment. Then she nodded, a small, careful nod that was not gratitude yet but was at least the beginning of a door opening. "I have coffee," she said, "if you want to come inside and tell me what you know about Kansas land law." He tied his horse at her fence post and walked across her frost-stiff grass and went inside. The farmhouse was small and neat, and showed the particular character of a woman who had decided to make a strange place her own through sheer force of determination. There were curtains at the windows that she had clearly sewn herself, a small braided rug before the hearth, a shelf of books above the fireplace that surprised him. Not the simple improving texts he might have expected, but a mix of practical volumes and what looked like actual novels, Dickens and something by George Eliot. A pair of Patrick's work boots stood beside the door, still muddy. She had not moved them. She poured coffee from a battered pot and set a cup in front of him and sat across the table and waited. She had the particular patience of someone who was very tired but had decided not to show it. He told her what he knew. He had some familiarity with Kansas land law, more than most, because when his father died there had been questions about the Archer deed, and he had spent time with a lawyer from Wichita sorting it through. He knew that a deed registered in her name was legally hers regardless of what Cyrus Donahue or the bank thought about her capacity to run the ranch. He knew that contesting a deed required substantial legal grounds and that "she is a woman" alone was not grounds, regardless of what Cyrus chose to believe. Emma listened without interrupting. She asked 3 questions at the end, all of them precise and practical. When he answered the third one, she pressed her lips together and looked at the table for a moment. "Patrick told me before he died," she said quietly, "that the land was mine. He said it more than once. He said he wanted to make sure I would never be left with nothing." She paused. "I did not know enough to understand what he was protecting me from." "You know now," Clayton said. She looked at him. "Because of you." He met her eyes, and something happened in that moment that he was not prepared for: a recognition, a pull, a feeling of looking at someone who was genuinely, stubbornly, quietly refusing to be broken, and finding it more admirable than anything he had seen in a very long time. "Because of you," he corrected. "You were already fighting. I just told you what weapons you had." The corner of her mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was near enough. Cyrus Donahue's lawyer arrived from Wichita on a Wednesday, a man named Strickland who wore a city suit and carried a leather briefcase and had the particular air of someone accustomed to making provincial people feel small. He met with Ben Hargrove at the Colton Savings and Loan that afternoon, and then he requested a meeting with Emma at the farmhouse the following morning. Clayton was there when Strickland arrived. He had not asked Emma's permission to be there. She had simply told him, 2 days prior when they had met again at the fence line to continue their conversation about the deed, that Strickland was coming on Thursday morning. She had said it in a tone that was neutral and informational, and he had said, equally neutrally, that he would be there at 8. She had not argued. Strickland knocked on the farmhouse door at 9, and when Emma opened it she was standing straight and composed, and Clayton was seated at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and what he hoped was the casual ease of a man who was simply there and had always been there and saw no reason to explain himself. Strickland was not pleased. He tried to have the conversation with Emma anyway, speaking over Clayton, addressing her with a patronizing gentleness that made Clayton's back teeth come together. But Emma was not susceptible to patronizing gentleness. She answered each of Strickland's points with the precise, measured accuracy of a woman who had spent 3 evenings memorizing the relevant sections of the Kansas statutes on property law that Clayton had ridden into town to fetch from the county clerk. When Strickland said the estate might benefit from an orderly transfer to Patrick's nearest blood relative, Emma said calmly, "The deed is registered in my name in the Colton County Deed Registry, filed February 1877. That makes me the legal owner. An orderly transfer would require my consent, which I do not give." When Strickland suggested that a woman managing a ranch alone would find it very difficult, and that Cyrus was prepared to offer a generous settlement, Emma said, "I appreciate the suggestion. My answer is no. When Strickland finally looked at Clayton and said with some frustration, "And what exactly is your role here, Mr. Archer?" Clayton said pleasantly, "Neighbor." Strickland left in under an hour. Cyrus Donahue, who had been waiting in Colton, came to the farmhouse himself that afternoon in a burst of temper, his face red and his words loud, and he said things to Emma that made Clayton stand up from his chair very slowly and quietly, which was, in his experience, more effective than standing up quickly. Cyrus looked at him, recalculated whatever he had been planning to say next, and finished his visit in a significantly shorter time than he had intended. When Cyrus was gone, Emma stood in the middle of her kitchen for a moment. Then she sat down at the table and put her hands flat on the surface and pressed them there, and Clayton could see her steadying herself, see the slight tremor that she had been holding back through sheer force of will. He did not say anything. He went to the stove and poured her a fresh cup of coffee and set it beside her hands and sat down across from her. "Thank you," she said after a while. "You did most of it," he said. "I would not have known to do any of it without you." She looked up. Her eyes were very dark, a deep brown, and they had in them something that he had begun to notice over the course of these last few days, a quality of full attention, of genuine looking that made him feel, strangely, as if he were being truly seen for the first time in a long while. "What are you going to do about the ranch?" he asked. It was a practical question, but it was also, he knew, a more intimate one than it might seem because it was really asking, "What do you want?" And there was something in the asking of it that acknowledged she had the right to want something, that her answer mattered. Emma looked at her coffee cup. "I am going to run it," she said. "I know I have not done it before. I know I do not know everything I need to know." A pause, but Patrick believed I could, and I find she paused again, and when she looked back at him her chin was set in a way he was beginning to recognize. "I find that I believe it too," he nodded. "Then you will need help. I cannot afford a full-time ranch hand." "I was not suggesting that," he said. "I was going to say that the people in this county, once they understand you are not going anywhere, will generally come around, and I will be here." He said it simply. He meant it simply. But the way Emma's eyes held on his for that moment, and the particular quiet that fell between them, was not simple at all. The spring moved forward into May, and May softened into the long, bright Kansas June, and somewhere in that time Clayton Archer became a fixture at the Donahue property in a way that neither he nor Emma ever formally discussed or decided. He came in the mornings, sometimes to help with the heavier work, the fence mending, and the water trough repairs, and the roof of the barn that had developed a concerning soft spot in the shingles. She came to the Archer spread sometimes in the evenings, because Delia had taken to inviting her for supper, and Delia was the kind of person whose invitations were nearly impossible to refuse. The family noticed. Randall noticed first, which was not surprising because Randall noticed anything that had the potential to complicate property arrangements. He said nothing to Clayton directly at first, only made a comment at supper one evening about the amount of time Clayton was spending on the western side of Sutter's Run, said with a particular emphasis that made its meaning clear. Clayton did not respond, which told Randall everything. Their mother noticed second, and her noticing was different, quieter, more observant, with the specific quality of a woman watching her son for signs of something she had been waiting for him to feel and was not sure whether to be glad or worried. Delia noticed third, and she was simply glad and did not try to hide it. Uncle Harold, who came for a visit in late June from Abilene, noticed within 2 hours of arriving, looked at Clayton over his coffee cup at breakfast and said, in his blunt way, "You are in love with the widow." Clayton said, "I am going to check the cattle." Harold said, "That is not a denial." He was right. It was not. The truth of what Clayton felt for Emma Hart had been building with the slow, inexorable momentum of weather coming across the plains, visible from a long way off if you were watching for it, and completely unstoppable by the time it arrived. It was not a dramatic thing in its coming. It was built from 100 small moments, The way she laughed at something unexpected with her whole face, and then looked almost surprised at herself for laughing, as if she had not expected to be capable of it. The way she learned things, systematically and thoroughly, asking questions without embarrassment, and then applying the answers with a precision that impressed everyone who saw it. The way she was, despite everything, despite the loss and the strangeness and the fear she never fully acknowledged, so fully, stubbornly, magnificently herself. He had felt attraction before. He had felt fondness before. What he felt for Emma was neither of those things in both of them, and it was also something he did not have a simple word for, a sense that she was someone without whom the world would be measurably smaller and less interesting, and that the thought of her being frightened or alone or hurt was something he could not tolerate. Emma, for her part, was more careful. She had come west on faith once before, and had built a life here through will and work, and the love of a decent, flawed, honest man who had died, and left her to reconstruct herself in his absence. She was not afraid of love, precisely, but she had learned to treat it with the same careful respect she gave a Greenbroke horse. It was powerful and could carry you a long way, but you needed to know what you were doing before you fully committed your weight. She noticed Clayton in ways she did not mention to anyone. She noticed the particular patience he had, the way he never pushed, never assumed, never spoke over her or past her. She noticed that he was funny, in a quiet, dry way that you could easily miss if you were not paying close attention, and that he was paying close attention to everything, to her ranch, to her challenges, to the small signs of what she needed before she said it. She noticed that when he was near, the large, sometimes frightening business of making a life alone in this vast, indifferent landscape felt less like an impossible weight and more like something she might actually manage. She did not say any of this to him. She was not ready to say it yet, but she thought about it. The trouble with Cyrus Donahue did not end with Strickland's visit. Cyrus was a man who had convinced himself that he had been wronged, and men like that are difficult to discourage because they have made their grievance into an identity and cannot abandon it without abandoning themselves. He stayed in Colton, taking a room at the Plainsman Hotel, and over the weeks he spent a great deal of time at the saloon and at Ben Hargrove's bank, and he talked, in the way that ineffectual, angry men often do, building his case in the court of local opinion. He suggested Emma was incompetent. He suggested the ranch would fail. He suggested, with the particular implication of a man who knows he cannot say a thing outright, that there was something questionable about the amount of time Emma was spending with the neighboring rancher. That last one reached Clayton by way of Harold, who had heard it at the saloon, and who delivered it to Clayton not as gossip but as a warning. "He is trying to dirty her name," Harold said. "A woman alone who is seen to be too friendly with a man, you know what people do with that." "I know," Clayton said. "Then what are you going to do about it?" Clayton thought about it for 2 days. He thought about what it meant for Emma's standing in the community, which she was building carefully, and which mattered enormously to her survival here. He thought about the unfairness of a situation where his help, which she needed, was also a liability, because of a social order that applied different rules to different genders. He thought about what Emma would say if he raised it with her. He decided to tell her directly. He went to the farmhouse on a Tuesday evening and he told her what Cyrus was saying, and he watched her face go through a sequence of emotions, anger, calculation, something that might have been hurt, and then settle into the particular composure that he had come to recognize as Emma at her most determined. "He wants me isolated," she said. "If he can make people uncomfortable associating with me, then I am easier to break." "Yes." She looked at him steadily. "Is that going to work?" "Not on me," he said, "but I wanted you to know what was being said, and to know that I would not think it right for my being here to cost you anything." Emma was quiet for a long moment. The evening light came through the kitchen window in long golden bars and lay across the table between them, and somewhere outside a meadowlark was singing with the particular extravagance that meadowlarks bring to long summer evenings. "Clayton," she said finally. "Yes." "Stop being so careful about protecting me from your feelings," she said. I am not made of glass. The words hit him somewhere behind the sternum. He looked at her. I am not sure I know what you mean, he said, which was entirely untrue. Emma's eyes had a particular quality in this moment, direct and steady and warm, that made her look very much like someone who had decided to stop waiting. I think you do, she said. He held her gaze, the meadowlark sang, the light moved. Emma, he said, I am not a man who speaks lightly. I know that about you, she said. It is one of the things she paused as if testing the weight of the next word before committing to it. One of the things I most appreciate about you. Then let me speak carefully, he said, and not lightly, a pause. I find that I think about this ranch and your safety on it and your happiness here more than I think about my own property. I find that I have not had an evening in the last 2 months where my last thought before sleep was not some version of wondering how you are. I find that whatever Cyrus Donahue or this county or anyone else thinks about my being here, I cannot make myself stop being here because this is where I want to be. Emma had gone very still. Her hands were flat on the table again, the way they went when she was steadying herself. That is very carefully spoken, she said. I told you it would be. It is also, she said, very much what I needed to hear. He reached across the table. She did not move her hands away. He covered her right hand with his, gently, not demanding anything, just present, just there. And she turned her hand over and held his, and they sat like that in the evening light with the meadowlark singing outside, and it was the simplest and the most significant thing that had happened to either of them in a very long time. The understanding between them grew from that evening with the same organic, unhurried momentum as the rest of their relationship, building layer by careful layer. There were no grand gestures and no dramatic declarations, only the accumulation of presence and conversation and trust that is the real substance of love, the kind that lasts. He took her riding on his property one Sunday afternoon, and she was a better horsewoman than he had expected, competent and confident in the saddle. And when he said so, she told him that she had grown up on a farm in Ohio and that horses were not strange to her. Only Kansas was strange, and that she was learning to make her peace with the strangeness. She showed him her books one evening when he came for supper at the farmhouse. She cooked well, with a plainness and directness that matched her character, nothing fancy but everything honest. And he told her he had never read George Eliot, and she looked at him as if he had admitted to some significant gap in his formation, and immediately pressed a copy of Middlemarch on him with the seriousness of someone distributing vital supplies. He read it. He told her what he thought of it. The conversation that followed lasted 3 hours and moved from the novel to questions of obligation and freedom, and what people owe to each other and what they owe to themselves. And somewhere in the middle of it, Emma said something so exactly right, so precisely true, that he stopped and looked at her with a feeling he recognized with sudden clarity as the particular joy of encountering a genuinely good mind, the joy of being challenged and matched. You should not have come here as someone's mail-lord or bride, he said, without thinking. You should have been a lawyer. She stared at him for a moment, and then she laughed her real laugh, the one that came from somewhere unguarded and was followed by that flash of surprise at herself. And then she said soberly, Patrick was not a bad reason to come. He was a good man. I know he was, Clayton said. I did not mean otherwise. I know you didn't, she said, and then, quieter, I am glad I came. He knew she was not only talking about Patrick. Cyrus Donahue, frustrated by the failure of conventional pressure, escalated in late July. The first sign was a confrontation at the feed store, where Cyrus told the proprietor, loudly enough for half the town to hear, that the Donahue property was encumbered in ways that Emma was not equipped to resolve, and that any business done with her was business done at risk. It was a lie, and Cyrus probably knew it was a lie, but it was the kind of lie that is difficult to disprove in the moment. The second sign was worse. On a Thursday night in the last week of July, Emma's barn caught fire. She did not know how it started. She woke at 2 in the morning to the smell of smoke and the sounds of the horses, and she got her animals out, all of them, because she moved fast and because the fire was still small enough, barely caught in the southeast corner of the loft when she first saw it. And then she stood in her yard in her night clothes and watched the corner of her barn burn while she ran back inside for a bucket and did the only thing she could do, which was fight it. By the time help arrived, the nearest farm family, the Murphys, 2 miles east, who saw the glow, the fire was mostly out. Emma had got water from the trough to the fire and back more times than she could count, and her arms were shaking, and her face was streaked with soot, and she had burned her right hand on the barn door handle. The corner of the loft was destroyed, but the structure stood. Clayton arrived 40 minutes after the Murphys, having ridden hard from the Archer spread when he saw the glow to the west from his own property. He came through the gate at a run and found Emma sitting on a fence post wrapped in a Murphy blanket, her burned hand held against her chest, watching the last of the smoke rise. He crossed the yard to her in 6 steps and put his hands on her face, tilting it up to look at her, checking her, cataloging the soot and the exhaustion and the burn. "Emma," he said. His voice had something raw in it that he did not try to conceal. "I am all right," she said. She always said she was all right first. He had learned this about her. "Your hand. It is not bad." She let him look at it. It was not terrible. A burn across the palm and 2 fingers. Painful and significant, but not dangerous if tended properly. He wrapped it carefully with the clean cloth from the Murphy woman's basket and held it with a gentleness that made Emma press her lips together against something she was not ready to release in front of an audience. Later, when the Murphys had gone home and the first gray light of dawn was beginning to show in the east, Clayton stayed. He sat beside Emma on the fence post and they looked at the damaged barn together in silence. "It was set," she said. He had been thinking the same thing. The fire had started in a corner with no lamp, no hay pile, no obvious source. "I think so," he said. "Cyrus, I do not have proof of that. I know she was quiet, but I know." He believed her. He knew she was right, and the feeling that moved through him in that moment at the image of a man setting a fire in a woman's barn in the middle of the night, with her inside, with her animals inside, was the furthest thing from calm. He kept it quiet and still in his chest, because losing his temper would not help Emma, but it was there. "What do you want to do?" he asked. "I want to stay," she said immediately. "I want to rebuild the corner of the barn and plant the fall garden and be here in January when the snow comes, because this is my land and I am not leaving it. Then we will need to be smart about Cyrus," he said. "Tell me how." He thought about it carefully. He knew enough about how these situations worked in Colton County, and in the West generally in 1878, to know that the law moved slowly and imperfectly, and that going to Sheriff Dawes with a suspicion about a barn fire was unlikely to produce justice quickly, if at all, especially when the accused was a man with money and a lawyer from Wichita. But there were other mechanisms. "The county deed office in Wichita," he said. "If the deed is fully registered and undisputed on the county record, with a clear record of the mortgage status, it becomes much harder for Cyrus to claim any interest in the property. The bank here, Hargrove, he is still friendly with Cyrus. If we go to Wichita directly and get the deed reviewed and confirmed at the state level, we take Hargrove out of the equation." Emma looked at him. "Can we do that?" "I believe we can. I will need to find out the exact procedure." He paused. "It would mean going to Wichita, 2 days' ride. When can we go?" He felt something move through him that was admiration and tenderness and love all at once. This woman with a burned hand and soot on her face, making plans in the gray light of dawn after watching her barn burn. "End of next week," he said. "I need to arrange things at the ranch, and you need to let your hand heal." She looked down at her wrapped hand. "All right," she said. And then quietly, "Clayton, yes, thank you for coming." "I will always come," he said. "I need you to know that." The weight of it settled between them, and she nodded, and it was one of those moments where the saying of a thing and the receiving of it needed no embellishment. They went to Wichita at the end of July, Emma and Clayton, riding together in his wagon with enough supplies for 3 days. It was the longest stretch of uninterrupted time they had spent together, and it had the quality of revelation that comes from being truly alone with someone, no community watching, no family asking questions, no immediate emergency requiring attention. Just the long prairie road and the summer heat, and two people who had been circling each other for months. They talked for hours. They talked about everything and nothing with the particular freedom of people who had discovered that they could. She told him about Ohio, about her parents' farm, about the younger siblings she had grown up taking care of, about the decision to answer Patrick's letter and come west, which she described with a mixture of recklessness and practicality that he found entirely characteristic. He told her about his father, about growing up in the shadow of Randall's management, and finding his own relationship with the land not through authority but through actual daily work, which he had come to love with a quiet but unshakable devotion. He told her about the year after his father died, which had been harder than he had told anyone, not only the grief but the reconstruction of the family's working order, the renegotiation of every assumption about how things should run. She listened. She asked questions. She did not offer easy comfort or rush past the difficult parts, and it was that quality of sitting with the difficult parts, of not flinching, that he kept returning to as the truest and most particular thing about her. On the first night they camped near the Walnut River, and the evening was warm enough to sit outside by the fire, and the sky above the Kansas prairie was so thick with stars that it seemed extravagant, almost unreasonable in its abundance. They sat side by side, and Emma put her head against his shoulder with the simple ease of someone who had decided to stop negotiating with what she felt, and he put his arm around her with the same ease, and they stayed like that while the fire burned down. "I am afraid sometimes," she said quietly, after a long silence. "Of what?" he asked, equally quiet. "Of depending on you too much," she said. "I came out here having learned to depend on myself because Patrick was not always there in the ways I needed, and I learned that I could bear things. And then you," she paused. "You are so thoroughly there, in every way. And I do not know what happens to a woman who learns to need someone and then loses them." He thought about this carefully before he answered, because it was the kind of thing that deserved care. "I am not Patrick," he said finally. "I cannot promise you that nothing will happen because no one can make that promise honestly, but I can tell you that I am not going anywhere by choice. That whatever you need from me, whether it is help with a barn roof or someone to go to Wichita with or just someone who will show up, I intend to be the man who does that, for as long as you will have me." Emma lifted her head to look at him. The firelight moved across her face. "That is a significant thing to say," she said. "I told you I do not speak lightly." She studied him for a moment, and then she reached up and put her hand against his jaw, that burned hand still tender and rapt, and he turned his face into it slightly and closed his eyes. "I have been," she said carefully, "trying very hard not to fall in love with you." "How has that been going?" he asked. "Extremely poorly," she said, "since approximately the second week of April." He laughed, a real laugh, low and genuine, and she looked startled for a moment, and then she was laughing too. And in the laughing and the starlight and the warmth of the fire he kissed her for the first time, gentle and deliberate, and she kissed him back with a completeness that told him everything he needed to know about whether she had managed to avoid falling in love with him. Wichita was 2 days of legal precision and bureaucratic navigation, and they accomplished everything they had come to accomplish. The state land office confirmed Emma's deed, with a clarity that left no legal room for Cyrus Donahue's claims. They returned to Colton with a registered copy of the deed and a letter from the state land assessor confirming the property's clear title, and Clayton delivered a copy of both documents personally to Ben Hargrove at the bank, and another copy to Sheriff Dawes, and told both men, with the quiet pleasantness that was more effective than anger, that any further interference with the Donahue property or its owner would be addressed through the state courts. Hargrove looked uncomfortable. Dawes looked thoughtful. Cyrus Donahue left Colton within the week. He did not say goodbye. He did not acknowledge Emma or Clayton. He simply was there one morning and gone the next, taking his city lawyer and his grievances and his hidden motives back to St. Louis, and the particular shape of threat that had defined Emma's last 4 months dissolved with him. The community of Colton, which had been watching carefully, adjusted accordingly. Several women from the church came to help Emma repair the barn corner. The Murphy family and 2 other neighboring families showed up one Saturday with tools and lumber and spent the day working, and by evening the barn was sound again. Emma stood in her yard that evening watching the neighbors leave, and Clayton stood beside her, and he could feel the moment shifting in her, the long-held tension releasing, the ground becoming solid under her feet in a way it had not been since February. "It is mine," she said softly. "It is truly mine." "It was always yours," he said. She looked at him. "You helped me make it real." He shook his head. "You were the one who never once considered leaving it." The question of what came next was one he had been thinking about for some time. He was not a man who moved without intention, and his intention was clear to him, had been clear for longer than he had perhaps admitted. What he needed to be certain of was that it was clear to Emma too, that she was choosing from a place of genuine freedom and not from gratitude or circumstance. He waited another month. August moved into September, the grass turning that particular gold that meant autumn was building in the north, and the days were warm and the nights were sharp with the first smell of coming cold. He helped Emma with the fall preparations for the ranch, the hay stores and the winterizing, and the accounting that she was now handling with a confident competence that made Colton's skeptics look increasingly foolish. On a Saturday afternoon in mid-September, he came to the farmhouse and found her in the garden, pulling the last of the late tomatoes before the frost that the sky was promising. She looked up when she heard him, and her face did the thing it did now when she saw him, opened, just slightly, with an uncomplicated warmth that was better than anything he had ever received from anyone. He helped her with the tomatoes. They carried the last of them inside and she washed them at the basin, and he stood near the window watching her, and when she turned around and saw his expression she set down the tomato she was holding. "What is it?" she said. "I want to ask you something," he said. "And I want you to know before I ask it that whatever your answer is, nothing changes between us. I will still be here. I will still be the man I have told you I intend to be." Emma looked at him with that full, steady attention. "I want to ask you," he said, "to marry me." The kitchen was very quiet. "I am asking you," he continued, "because I love you, and because I want to be your partner in this life you are building, and because I am quite certain I have never been as happy in my daily existence as I am when I am working alongside you, arguing with you, reading beside you, sitting on a fence post with you in the dark watching smoke rise." A pause. "And because when I imagine the future, the only version of it that makes any sense to me is one where you are in it." Emma's eyes were bright. She was not a woman who cried easily, and she was not crying now, but her eyes had that particular quality. "Clayton Archer," she said. "Emma Hart," he said. "I will marry you," she said, "on one condition." His heart was doing something undignified. "Name it." "I keep my name on the deed," she said. "This land is mine. I have worked for it and fought for it, and when we are married I want it to remain in my name, or in both our names. I will not have it absorbed and disappeared." He held her gaze for one moment. And then he said with absolute certainty, "Of course." Her face broke open into the real smile, the one that she saved. She crossed the kitchen to him and he put his arms around her and she pressed her face against his collar, and he held her with everything he had. "Yes," she said again, her voice muffled against his shirt. "Absolutely yes." He should have anticipated what happened next, and perhaps he did anticipate it, but anticipating a thing and experiencing it are different exercises. He went to the Archer family home the following Sunday morning and told them. The response was not what he might have called unified in its enthusiasm. Randall's concern was the land. He said it carefully, framing it in terms of family legacy and the Archer holdings, and what it meant for the long-term management of the county's property arrangements. But what he meant, underneath the careful framing, was that he had hoped the Donahue property might eventually come into the Archer family's orbit through some more advantageous arrangement, and this was not that. He did not say this in so many words. He said enough, however, for Clayton to understand it clearly. His mother was more nuanced. She worried, she said, about Emma's background, about the lack of family connection, about whether this was happening too fast, about whether Clayton was certain he was not simply responding to a crisis situation with inappropriate emotion. She said these things with the genuine concern of a woman who loved her son, and he tried to receive them that way. Uncle Harold, who was there again, he seemed to be always there during important moments, like a weather vane, said nothing, which was itself a statement. Delia said, finally, and hugged him, which was the response he had needed. The argument built over the following days. Randall came to him directly and raised the question of the deed, the Donahue property deed, Emma's deed, and whether, if there were to be a marriage, there was a way to restructure the property arrangement so that the Donahue land came into the Archer family name. He said it diplomatically. He said it as if it were simply a practical matter. But what he was asking, underneath the diplomacy, was whether Clayton would use the marriage to take from Emma exactly what she had spent the last 6 months fighting to keep. Clayton was quiet for a long time after Randall finished speaking. "No," he said. "I am not suggesting anything underhanded," Randall said. "It would simply be—" "No," Clayton said again with more finality. "Clayton, think about the family position. I have thought about it. The Donahue property is adjacent to our eastern section. It could form the basis of a significant Randall." Clayton turned to look at his brother fully, and there was something in his expression that stopped Randall's next sentence. "Emma fought for that land. She fought Cyrus Donahue and a Wichita lawyer and a bank and a county that was inclined to dismiss her, and she kept it. She kept it through her own courage and intelligence and refusal to be beaten. I will not be the man who takes it from her through the back door of a marriage contract. Do you understand me?" Randall was silent. "I love Emma Hart," Clayton said, "and she will be my wife, and that land is hers and will remain hers. If that is a problem for your property calculations, then I am sorry for it, but it is not a negotiable point." Randall left without answering, which was not agreement but was not further argument either. The family meeting that followed, the one that became, in Archer family memory, the night Clayton made his position irrevocably clear, happened on a Friday evening in October, when his mother called them all together at the family house. Margaret Archer had called such meetings before, usually when she had decided that something needed to be settled and that she was the one who would settle it. Clayton arrived knowing what was coming, knowing the shape of the argument, and having already decided every answer he would give. They gathered in the parlor. The fire was going. The wind pressed the windows. And his mother, gentle and firm and sincere in her worry, opened by saying that she thought they all ought to talk about this together as a family, that she had some concerns she needed to voice, that Randall had raised points she thought deserved consideration, and that they all wanted Clayton's happiness, of course, but— Clayton let her finish. He listened to Randall's restatement of the property concerns. He listened to his Uncle Harold say in his direct way that he thought Emma seemed like a fine woman but that the speed of the whole thing made him uneasy. He listened to all of it with the patience of a man who has already made up his mind and is waiting for the correct moment. And then he stood up. "She is keeping this land," he said. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. "And I will not hear another word about it." He looked around the room. He looked at his mother, who had worry in her eyes but something else too, something that might have been the beginning of understanding. He looked at Randall, who had set his jaw. He looked at Harold, who was watching him with an expression that had shifted into something almost like satisfaction. "Emma Hart is going to be my wife," he said. "And the Donahue property is hers by deed, by right, and by law, and she has earned every inch of it, and no one in this family will interfere with that. I am not asking permission. I am telling you what is going to happen." A pause. And I am also telling you that if you will give Emma a chance, if you will stop thinking about property lines and start thinking about the person, you will find that she is someone worth knowing. She is brave and she is honest and she is smart and she loves this land in exactly the way you would want someone to love it. She will not diminish what has been built here. She will be part of building more. The fire crackled. I have made my decision, he said quietly. I hope this family will support it, but it is made regardless. Delia reached over and squeezed his arm. Harold made a sound that was somewhere between a grunt and a laugh. His mother looked at him for a long time and then she said softly she would have to come for dinner. It was not a blessing exactly, but it was a beginning. Emma came for dinner. She arrived on a Sunday afternoon in late October, and she wore her best dress, a deep blue wool, and she had done her hair with more care than usual, and she brought a pie that she had made from the last of her autumn apples. She walked into the Archer family parlor with the same straight-backed composure she had shown Strickland in her kitchen, and she shook Margaret Archer's hand and said, "Thank you for having me." And then she said to Randall, who was watching her with the expression of a man who had not fully surrendered his reservations, "Mr. Archer, I understand you have concerns about the property arrangements. I am happy to discuss them plainly if you would like." Randall blinked. He had not expected that. "Over dinner, perhaps," he said. "Perfectly fine," Emma said. It was, Clayton thought, watching this, the most Emma thing she could possibly have done, not deflecting the tension, not pretending it was not there, but walking directly at it with her chin level and her hands steady. The dinner was not easy, but it was honest, which was better. Randall did raise his concerns in more measured form than before, and Emma addressed them, also in measured form, and at one point she said something about the longer-term agricultural potential of the western part of the county that made Randall stop and look at her as if he was recalibrating something. His mother asked Emma about Ohio, about her family, and Emma answered with the directness and warmth that she brought to everything, and somewhere in the description of her childhood, the farm, the siblings, the particular character of her mother's kitchen in the fall, Margaret's expression softened measurably. Harold mostly ate and watched and made occasional dry comments that were, upon consideration, supportive. Delia and Emma had a conversation about books at the end of the meal that lasted 45 minutes, and from which Clayton and everyone else were essentially excluded, and it was the best possible sign. When Emma left that evening, Clayton walked her to her wagon, and they stood beside it in the cold October air with the stars sharp and clear above the plains, and Emma looked at him with a slight smile. "Your mother is going to come around," she said. "How do you know?" "She asked me about my apple tree, whether it was the same variety as the one she remembers from Virginia." Emma paused. Women do not ask each other about apple trees unless they are trying to find common ground. He laughed. He put his arms around her and she leaned into him, and he pressed his face against her hair, which smelled like wood smoke and apples, and felt the particular gratitude of a man who had nearly not said what needed saying and had said it anyway. "I love you," he said. She tilted her head back to look at him. "I know," she said. "I love you too." And then, with the slight edge she sometimes put in things to keep them from becoming too solemn, "Your family is alarming." "Most families are," he said. "I think I will be able to manage them," she said thoughtfully. "The trick with Randall is to give him something useful to think about. The trick with your mother is apple trees, apparently." "Harold, I do not need a trick for." "Harold told me tonight," Clayton said, "that you are the best thing that has happened to this county since the railroad." Emma stared at him. "He said that. He said it to my face. I have never heard Harold say anything that kind about anyone." She laughed, and then she shook her head slowly. "I am going to like him." They were married in December. The ceremony was at the Colton Methodist Church on a Saturday, and the weather was cold but clear. The sky that particular deep winter blue that makes everything look newly painted. The whole community came, or nearly all of it, because the story of Emma Hart and the Donahue land was the story of the county that season. the story people told each other, because it was about something they recognized, about a person who refused to be moved, and the man who stood beside her. Emma wore a dress she had made herself from cream-colored wool, practical and beautiful, with her dark hair pinned back, and a small spray of dried lavender at the collar, because the florist had no fresh flowers in December, but Emma had dried lavender from her summer garden and said that would do perfectly. She walked up the aisle without anyone to give her away, because the people she might have chosen for that were 800 miles away in Ohio, and she had written to them, and they had written back with joy and the inability to travel, and she had decided that walking herself up the aisle was in its own way appropriate, because she had gotten herself here and that was worth acknowledging. Clayton was waiting for her at the front of the church with the expression of a man who is doing everything in his power not to look overwhelmed and is not entirely succeeding. He was overwhelmed. He was not ashamed of it. They said their vows in the plain language of the Methodist ceremony, and when the Reverend asked Clayton whether he took this woman, Clayton said, "I do," with a quiet certainty that made the women in the second row exchange glances. When he was told he could kiss his bride, he did, with the same deliberateness he brought to everything, and Emma kissed him back, and the church made a sound of collective warmth. The reception was held at the Murphys' large farmhouse nearby, because it had room enough, and there was music from a local fiddler and food from a dozen different households, and a warmth generated by a community that had watched something difficult become something good, and was celebrating accordingly. Randall danced with Emma at some point in the evening, which nobody had predicted, and they talked while they danced with the look of two people who were in the process of establishing a wary respect. When the dance ended, Randall said something to her, quietly, that Clayton did not hear, and Emma nodded, and afterwards Clayton asked her what he had said. "Said the land is well managed," she told him. "He said he could see it when he rode past." "High praise," Clayton said. "It is the highest praise I could have gotten from him," she said. "I know that." Margaret Archer hugged Emma at the end of the evening properly with both arms and said something in her ear that made Emma go still for a moment and then hug her back. Clayton never found out what his mother said. Emma told him only that it was something she needed to hear and that she was grateful for it. He accepted that. Delia, slightly unsteady from a glass more wine than was her custom, told Clayton at the end of the night that he had done the right thing and that she was proud of him and that Emma was the best person she had met in years. "I know," he said. "You always know," Delia said. "It is your most annoying quality." Harold, leaving, shook Clayton's hand and said nothing, only nodded once. It was enough. The winter of 1878 going into 1879 was cold, the way Kansas winters could be, with snow that came in earnest in January and temperatures that required respect. But the Donahue farmhouse, which Emma had already begun calling simply the Hart-Archer place, in a small, deliberate act of identity preservation that Clayton supported entirely, was warm and well-stocked, and they weathered it together with the particular contentment of two people who had made the right choice. They had decided to make Emma's property their main home, rather than moving to the Archer spread, because the Donahue farmhouse was Emma's, and because it made practical sense for their plan, which was to develop the Donahue ranch into something more substantial while maintaining Clayton's share of the Archer operation under a working arrangement with Randall. It required some renegotiation with Randall, which was not simple, but which was helped considerably by Emma's direct, practical approach to the financial conversation, which impressed Randall more than he admitted, and which laid a working relationship between them that was, over time, genuinely useful to both. Clayton brought his books and a few pieces of furniture that had been his father's and some tools and his dogs, two large cattle dogs named Sutter and Joe, who immediately accepted Emma with the directness of dogs and spent the rest of that winter underfoot in the farmhouse kitchen. Emma kept Patrick's boots by the door for the first winter. In the spring she moved them to the shed, gently and without ceremony. She was not forgetting Patrick, She was making room. Spring came again, and with it the particular renewal that spring always brought to the plains, the grass greening, the cattle moving with more energy, the days lengthening with the slow generosity of light that was the compensation for winter's harshness. Emma planted the garden with a scope and ambition that was significantly larger than the previous year's attempt, because she had a better sense now of what the land would bear and what the kitchen needed. She was also, by late April, quietly aware that something was changing in her own body, and by May she was certain enough to tell Clayton. She told him in the kitchen in the evening, simply and directly as she told him everything. He sat very still for a moment after she said it. Then he stood up from the table and came around to her and knelt beside her chair and took both her hands and looked up at her with an expression that she had never seen on his face before, something wholly unguarded, something that was joy and terror and love all compounded into something that had no single word for it. "Are you well?" was the first thing he said. She smiled. "I am very well," she said. He pressed his forehead against her clasped hands and stayed there for a long moment. "Good," he said. His voice was unsteady in a way that was entirely unlike him and entirely endearing. "Good." They told the family at the next Sunday dinner, which had become, over the winter months, a genuine institution. The Archers and Emma and Clayton around the table at the Archer house, a weekly ritual that had required some navigation to establish, but which had become something they all, individually and separately, looked forward to. Margaret Archer received the news with a brightness in her eyes that she did not attempt to contain. Delia pressed both hands to her face. Randall said, with what was for Randall a remarkable amount of warmth, "That is very good news," and shook Clayton's hand. Harold, reached by letter in Abilene, wrote back in 3 days with a letter that was, for Harold, effusive 4 whole sentences, all positive. The pregnancy proceeded without drama. Emma was practical about it, the way she was practical about everything, making sensible adjustments and accepting help when it made sense to accept it and declining it when it did not. Clayton was attentive in a way that walked the careful line between care and smothering, because he was aware of the line and Emma had been specific about where it was. "I'm not fragile," she told him in June when he suggested perhaps she should not be carrying the water buckets. "I know you are not fragile," he said. "The buckets are heavy. They were heavy before February. They were, and I carried them then." "You did." A pause. "Is this going to be an argument?" "Not if you will let me carry the buckets." She studied him. Then she handed him the buckets. "Fine," she said, "but only because you will make that face for the rest of the day if I do not." "What face?" "The worried one, the one where your jaw does the thing." "My jaw does not do a thing, Clayton." He took the buckets. The summer was good. The ranch was beginning to show the results of their combined efforts, the herd growing carefully, the infrastructure improving, the financial picture becoming measurably cleaner. Randall, in one of their working meetings in July, allowed that the Hart-Archer cattle looked well, and when Clayton pressed him, Randall acknowledged that the western grazing arrangement Emma had devised, rotating the cattle to let the grass recover between seasons, was showing better pasture quality than the Archer main spread. He said it as if it pained him slightly to admit it. Clayton accepted it with appropriate graciousness. Emma and Margaret Archer had, by midsummer, arrived at something genuine between them. It had not happened all at once. It had happened through the apple tree conversation at dinner, and through a subsequent afternoon in spring, when Margaret had come to the Hart-Archer place, and they had walked the garden together, and through the exchange of recipes that turned into an exchange of something more personal, and through the natural leveling that pregnancy produces in many women, a common ground that transcended other differences. By August, they were writing each other letters when they could not visit, which Clayton thought was one of the more unexpected and pleasing developments of the entire year. The baby came in late November, a week before it was expected, on a cold Tuesday morning when the first real snow of the season was falling outside. A neighbor woman, Mrs. Murphy, was there, and a midwife from town, and Clayton, who had not been certain he would be permitted to be present and was, and who stood at Emma's shoulder through the hours of it with a steadiness that was everything he had. The baby was a boy. They named him Thomas after Clayton's father. Emma had suggested it, unprompted, on an evening in September when they were sitting beside the fire, and the names had come up for the first time as a real discussion rather than an abstract one. Clayton had gone quiet when she said it, and she had watched him carefully, and he had said after a moment, "Are you certain?" And she had said, "Your father made this land what it is. Your father made you what you are." "Yes, I am certain." Thomas Archer came into the world on a snowy November morning with a considerable opinion about it already. A loud, vigorous, dark-haired baby who immediately established himself as someone with strong views on comfort and promptness. Emma held him with the complete stillness of a woman who has come through something difficult and arrived at something irreplaceable, looking at him with an expression that Clayton watched from beside her and thought he would remember exactly: the quality and angle of the light, the sound of the snow outside, the weight of the moment, for the rest of his life. He put his hand against Thomas's small head and then pressed his lips to Emma's temple, and she leaned her head slightly into it. "We did this," she said quietly. "You did most of it," he said. "I was primarily moral support." "You were more than that," she said. He held her hand. The months that followed Thomas's arrival were full in the way that new parenthood always is, full of the particular exhaustion and wonder of a small person who needs everything and gives back, in the form of presence and demand, something that reorganizes every other priority. Clayton proved to be the kind of father he had been, the kind of neighbor and husband, patient, attentive, present, learning quickly, and without ego. Emma recovered with her characteristic efficiency and refused to be sidelined from the ranch work longer than necessary, which led to exactly the argument with Clayton that anyone who knew them both could have predicted, and which was resolved in the way their arguments generally were, by Emma making a specific and persuasive case and Clayton listening to it seriously and either capitulating where she was right or holding his position where he was, and them finding between them an arrangement that was workable. Thomas grew. The Hart Archer place grew too, in the way that a well-run ranch does, incrementally, through good decisions made consistently over time. They added to the herd. They repaired and expanded the barn. They hired 2 permanent ranch hands, both local young men who were competent and whose presence freed Clayton and Emma for the work of managing and planning rather than doing everything themselves. The financial picture improved to the point where Emma, reviewing the accounts in the fall of Thomas's first year, said with a quiet satisfaction that was all the celebration she needed, "We are solvent, genuinely solvent." "We have been solvent since August," Clayton said. "I know, but now I truly believe it." He understood the distinction entirely. Cyrus Donahue, the shadow that had hung over the beginning of all of this, did not return. A letter came from St. Louis in the spring of 1880, not from Cyrus himself but from a St. Louis lawyer, addressed to Emma, containing a formal statement that Cyrus Donahue relinquished any claim on the Donahue estate in Colton County, Kansas. It was apparently prompted by some development in Cyrus's own legal situation in Missouri that made him motivated to clear any outstanding encumbrances from his name. Emma read the letter, folded it carefully, put it in the deed box beside her deed, and did not speak of Cyrus Donahue again. The family, the Archers, the extended family, found their way to a genuine warmth with Emma over time, the way families generally do when the person in question is worth knowing and the time is allowed to do its work. Margaret became, not a replacement mother, Emma was clear about that distinction in her own heart, but a genuine friend, which was a different thing, and in its way better. Randall developed a working respect that was not quite warmth but was honest and real. Delia was, and remained, the kind of relationship that Emma had missed most since leaving Ohio, a friend who was also family, someone to argue with and laugh with and count on. Harold, who came from Abilene twice a year, declared Thomas to be a fine specimen at every visit, which was, everyone understood, Harold's version of besotted. 3 years after the wedding in the spring of 1882, Emma told Clayton she was expecting again. He received this news with the somewhat more practiced equanimity of a man who had been through it once, though he was not, in truth, substantially more calm about it than the first time. He was simply better at appearing calm. Another boy. Delia asked when the news was shared. "We do not know," Emma said. "I am hoping for a girl," Delia said. "We will see what we get," Emma said with a slight smile, "and be glad of it." The second child was a girl. They named her Clara after Emma's mother in Ohio, and she arrived in the warm September of 1882 with the same loud opinions as her brother, which Emma said was clearly a family trait now, and Clayton said he did not know where they got it from, and Emma looked at him until he acknowledged, reluctantly, that he knew exactly where they got it from. Clara was dark like Emma and Thomas. Thomas was beginning to show, in the angles of his face and the set of his jaw, an unsettling resemblance to Clayton that made Margaret Archer quiet and pleased in the way of grandmothers who see their people continuing. He was 4 years old when Clara was born and took to his sister with a protective seriousness that Emma said was entirely his father's, and Clayton refused to confirm or deny. On a Sunday afternoon in the autumn of 1882, Clayton and Emma sat on the porch of the Hart Archer farmhouse, the porch he had added the previous summer, a proper wide porch with 2 chairs and a small table, built because Emma said she wanted a place to sit and see the whole of her land at once, and they looked out across the property together. The grass was that October gold. The herd was visible in the far pasture. The barn was sound and painted, and significantly larger than the one Emma had defended from Cyrus Donahue's fire 4 years ago. The garden was cleared for winter, the last of the harvest put by. From inside came the sound of Thomas's voice telling a story to himself, and the sound of Clara making the small demanding sounds of a baby who has recently become aware that she has considerable power. Clayton had his arm around Emma and she was leaning against him, and the evening was not cold yet, just cool enough to be comfortable, and the sky was doing the extravagant thing it did in Kansas in autumn, going orange and rose along the horizon. "Do you remember," Emma said quietly, "the first morning you came to my fence line?" "I was checking the fence," he said. "You were most certainly not checking the fence." "I was adjacent to the fence," he allowed. She laughed softly. "I saw you sitting there on that bay horse and I thought, who is this man and why is he watching my smoke? I was thinking about whether to introduce myself." "You were thinking about a lot more than that." He said, possibly. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I was afraid that whole first week. Not of Cyrus exactly. I was afraid that I had made a terrible mistake coming here, that Patrick's death meant the whole thing had been a wrong choice and I was going to be left with nothing and would have to go back to Ohio and start over, and the idea of starting over from nothing again was," she paused, finding the word, "exhausting." "You never showed that," he said. "I was not going to show it to strangers," she said. "I was barely going to show it to myself." A pause. "And then you came across the frost with your coffee explanation and your copy of Kansas land law, and I thought this might actually be all right. Just all right." She looked up at him. Her eyes were warm and very direct, the same eyes that had been taking him apart across 40 feet of frost-stiff grass the first morning he came to her fence line. "Better than all right," she said. "You know that." "I do," he said. "I know that." He pressed his lips against her hair. She settled against him with the easy, complete comfort of a woman who has found exactly where she is supposed to be and has no plans to go anywhere else. Inside, Thomas's story grew more elaborate. Clara made an authoritative sound. The land lay golden before them, hers and his, theirs, fought for and kept and built into something that was not only a ranch or a deed or a line on a county map, but a life. A full, honest, difficult, joyful life, made between 2 people who had recognized in each other something irreplaceable, and had been stubborn enough and brave enough to refuse to let it go. The sun reached the horizon and began its final descent, painting the sky in colors that had no names adequate to them, and Clayton Archer and Emma Hart sat on their porch and watched their land hold the light, and said nothing more because nothing more needed saying. The seasons turned. Thomas grew into a boy who was serious about learning and had his mother's directness and his father's patience, a combination that made him an unusually capable child, who the ranch hands, with some confusion and considerable respect, found themselves taking seriously by the time he was 7. Clara grew into a girl with Clayton's dry, quiet humor and Emma's absolute refusal to be argued out of something she had decided, which created in their household a particular dynamic that kept everyone on their toes. In the spring of 1885, when Thomas was 6 and Clara was 2.5, and the Hart Archer Ranch had become one of the most reliably well-run operations in Colton County, Randall Archer came to them with a proposition. He had been thinking, he said, about expanding the cattle operation, not the Archer spread alone, but a cooperative arrangement with the Hart Archer property that would allow them to leverage the combined grazing land and the combined water rights along Sutter's Run in a way that would benefit both properties significantly. He came to Emma with this proposal, not to Clayton. That was not accidental, and both of them knew it was not accidental. And when Emma looked at Randall across her kitchen table and then looked at Clayton and then looked back at Randall, there was a moment of understanding between all three of them that needed no words. Emma said she would think about it and discuss it with Clayton and give him an answer by the end of the week. She discussed it with Clayton that evening. They agreed the proposal was sound and that Randall had come a considerable distance to make it, and that the distance was worth acknowledging. They accepted, with certain conditions that Emma specified and that Randall accepted without argument. The partnership they formed was one of the better commercial arrangements in the county that decade, and it built something between the Archers and the Hart Archers that was more solid than what had preceded it. Not just family, but genuine collaboration between equals who had worked hard to learn to respect each other. Emma wrote to her family in Ohio regularly, and her youngest sister, a girl named Rose who had been 15 when Emma left and was now 22, came to Kansas in the summer of 1885 for a visit that lasted 3 months and ended with Rose deciding to stay, having met a schoolteacher in Colton with whom she was thoroughly and delightfully besotted. The wedding was the following spring, and it was, as Emma told Clayton privately the evening after it, the first time since coming to Kansas that she had felt her two worlds genuinely meet. "I feel like a whole person," she said simply. She was sitting at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a cup of tea, and the evening light was long and golden through the window, and she looked settled, in the deepest possible way, in a way that was nothing like defeat and everything like arrival. "You always were," he said. "I did not always know it," she said. "That is different." He sat down across from her. "What made you know it?" he asked. She considered this seriously, which was her way, treating even the personal questions with the respect of genuine thought. "I think," she said slowly, "it was the moment you stood up in that parlor and told your family I was keeping this land. I heard about it after the fact. Delia told me." She paused. "I had not asked you to do that. You had not consulted me about it. You just decided. And the deciding was so completely in my corner, so unreservedly, that I understood something." She looked at him. "I understood that you would always stand on my side of things, not because I was weak and needed protection, but because you believed in what I was doing, in who I was. And when someone who is good and honest believes in who you are," she paused again, finding the words, "it helps you believe it too." Clayton was quiet for a moment. "You never needed me to believe in you," he said. "You would have kept that land whether I showed up at your fence line or not." "Probably," she agreed. "But it would have been harder and lonelier and less," she looked for the word, "less inhabited. You made my life inhabited." He reached across the table and took her hand, the one that still had a faint scar across the palm from the night of the fire, barely visible now, but there if you knew to look, which he did. "You did the same for me," he said. She turned her hand in his and held it, and they were quiet together in the evening kitchen, while the golden light stretched across the floor, and Thomas could be heard outside calling to one of the dogs, and Clara's voice answered from further away, managing, as she did, to sound simultaneously like her mother, and like no one else who had ever existed. The years that followed were good ones, the kind of years that do not make dramatic stories but make strong lives, years of work and weather, and the incremental building of something worth building, of children growing into themselves and showing new qualities that pleased and surprised their parents, of neighbors who became friends and friends who became essential, of the land itself, which rewarded those who worked it honestly and punished those who didn't, and was beautiful in any case. In 1888, the deed to the Hart Archer property was reviewed and re-registered, as deeds were periodically, and the name on it was clear and legal and uncontested. Emma Hart, with Clayton Archer as co-holder. The county clerk, a young man who had not been there in the Cyrus Donahue days, simply processed it without comment. There was no drama. There was no fight. The name was simply there, as it had always been, as it would continue to be, on a piece of paper in the Colton County Deed Registry that said, in the plain language of law, that this land belonged to her. Emma did not celebrate this particularly. She noted it with a small, private satisfaction, the kind that lives in the bones rather than needing expression. Clayton, riding back from Colton after the deed processing was completed, pulled his horse to a stop at the top of the gentle rise that looked down over the whole of the Hart Archer, spread the farmhouse with the wide porch, the big sound barn, the good fencing, the garden and the vegetable beds, and the planted windbreak of cottonwoods they had put in 3 years ago, and which were now genuinely providing shelter. He could see Emma in the yard, talking to one of the ranch hands about something, with the manner of a woman who knows exactly what she is talking about. He could see Thomas in the near pasture, doing something with a horse. Clara, he knew, was inside with his mother, who came on Tuesdays now and had begun teaching Clara to sew, which was a project of some ambition given Clara's relationship with sitting still. He sat on his horse and looked at it all and thought about a cold April morning in 1878, when he had ridden along Sutter's Run telling himself he was checking the fence line, and had seen smoke rising from a chimney and a woman walking across frost-stiff grass with a bucket in each hand. He had not known that morning what was beginning. He knew now. He touched his heels to his horse and rode down into the yard, and Emma looked up when she heard him coming and shaded her eyes against the afternoon light, and even from this distance he could see the slight shift in her expression that was his particular thing, the one that was only for him, the opening, the warmth, the full attention. He brought his horse to the fence and tied it and walked across the yard to her. "Done," she said. "Done," he said. "The deed is confirmed." She nodded. She had known it would be. She had never, not for a single moment in the last 10 years, doubted that this land was hers and would remain so. "Good," she said simply. He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, and they stood together in the autumn afternoon and looked at what they had made, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was, by any honest accounting, everything. The land was hers. It always had been. And the man beside her, steady, stubborn, endlessly, quietly, completely certain of her, had understood that from the very first morning, when he had ridden to a fence line to check something he already knew the answer to, and had found, on the other side of it, everything he had not known he was looking for. She had kept the land. He had kept his word. And between those two things they had built a life that was, in all the ways that truly mattered, unbreakable.